The machines beeped steadily, but they couldn't fill the silence. Something about that quiet. It felt heavier than sound. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes you forget to breathe. Nurses had come and gone. Doctors whispered updates no one wanted to hear, and the hallway lights flickered outside the ICU room. But inside, it was just him and her. She wasn't supposed to be there. Wild animals don't belong in hospitals. But rules were quietly ignored that night. The Bobcat, with her dusky coat and bright amber eyes, padded softly across the linoleum floor, led by a nurse who kept glancing over her shoulder. As soon as the Bobcat entered, she didn't pause. She leapt onto a hospital bed with a grace that surprised even the exhausted night staff, and settled down beside the young man's chest like she'd always belonged there. She hadn't seen him in weeks. And yet, without a sound, she seemed to know. She placed one paw gently on his rib cage, her nose brushing his collarbone. The rhythm of her breathing matched the rise and fall of the ventilator. And then she stayed absolutely still. The room dimmed. Outside the window, the streetlights blurred behind streaks of cold rain. Cars passed below, unaware of what was happening several floors up in this quiet, sterile room. But inside, the tension was alive, like something sacred was unfolding, like something was coming to an end. She was just a bobcat, born wild, untamed. She had once hissed and lunged and trembled at the sight of a human hand. But this man, this quiet man lying unconscious beneath hospital white sheets, had changed her. Years ago, he found her in the woods, barely alive, too small to hunt, too injured to run. She should have died that night, but he didn't let her. He stayed up with her for days, fed her with dropper milk, and rubbed her ribs when she couldn't breathe, let her sleep beside him because her cries didn't stop when left alone. Slowly, she stopped fearing him. Then she started watching him. Then she followed him. And before anyone realized it, she was his shadow. And now, in this room, she was his keeper. No words had ever passed between them. None were needed. Their entire relationship had been built on silences, on gestures, on the way she'd bump his arm when she wanted attention, on the way he'd press his forehead gently to hers when the world got too loud. And now, even though he hadn't opened his eyes in days, something shifted in the room. His fingers twitched, just barely, and the bobcat felt it. Her eyes opened, wide and sharp. She leaned closer to his face and let out the softest sound, a sound no one had ever heard her make before. A whimper, not a growl, not a purr, something between sorrow and goodbye. The nurse standing at the door wiped a tear before it to fall. She'd seen a lot in this place, but never this. The bobcat's body curled tighter against his. She didn't close her eyes. She just watched and waited and breathed with him. The machines hummed, his breathing shallow. A light above flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped rapidly before falling silent. And then everything was still again. He hadn't moved, but something in the air said everything had changed. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The nurse stepped back, unsure whether to interrupt. But she didn't have to decide. The bobcat moved. She shifted forward slowly and pressed her forehead to his, the way he used to do for her. Then she climbed down. No rush, no panic. She walked back toward the door, past the nurse, who held it open with trembling hands. The bobcat didn't look back. She just walked into the hallway, where a cold draft swirled in from the end exit and disappeared into shadow. No one knew where she went after that. But in that room, on that bed, the warmth of her body still lingered on his chest. And for the first time in days, the room didn't feel quite so cold. It hadn't always been hospitals and silence. Before all this, there was a cabin tucked deep in the woods, where the trees whispered in the wind and the scent of pine soaked into everything. No paved roads, no fences, just acres of forest and one man who had chosen to live in the quiet. His name was Nathan. Nathan wasn't running from anything. He just didn't feel at home in the noise of cities. He preferred the stillness of the forest, the honest rhythm of seasons, and the company of animals who never said more than they needed to. He had built that cabin himself, with callous hands and a slow, steady heart. The wood creaked when it got cold. The roof sometimes leaked. But it was his world, and it was in that world that he found her. It was late autumn when she first appeared. He'd heard the sharp cries echoing through the trees, faint at first, then desperate, a sound that didn't belong to any bird or raccoon. It was sharper, rawer, like something in pain. He followed the sound for hours, careful not to spook whatever it was. That's when he saw her. A tiny bobcat cub curled at the base of a fallen log, soaked from the rain, one paw twisted awkwardly beneath her. Her eyes were still fierce, even in fear. She bared her teeth as he approached, a trembling bundle of fur and fire. But she didn't have the strength to run. He didn't touch her right away. He sat near the log, slowly inching closer over time. He left bits of food, raw chicken, small pieces of cooked meat. She wouldn't eat while he watched, but in the mornings, the offerings were always gone. Every day he returned. He spoke softly, never reaching for her, never forcing closeness. It took 4 days before she let him near. She hissed when he picked her up, her body tense, but her claws didn't strike. It was as if she'd finally decided to trust him, or maybe just surrender to exhaustion. He wrapped her gently in his old flannel shirt and carried her back to the cabin, one step at a time to the wet, leaf-strewn path. That first night, she didn't sleep. Neither did he. She whimpered in her sleep, a tiny sound that clawed at the silence of the room. He lay on the floor beside her, one hand resting just near her side, not touching, just there. By the second week, she began following him with her eyes, then with her steps. She limped awkwardly at first, dragging her injured paw. But Nathan had learned a few things about mending bones and tending wounds. His bookshelf was full of old veterinary manuals and survival guides, worn at the edges. He used what he knew and what he felt. And it worked. He named her Ember, not because of her fur, but because of her spirit. Small, fierce, and burning even in the coldest dark. Ember grew fast. Bobcats aren't meant for cages or collars, but Nathan never tried to make her into a pet. He didn't try to tame her. He just made space. She came and went as she pleased, vanishing into the woods for hours, sometimes days. But she always returned. At first, she brought back small trophies, feathers, bones, pieces of bark. Later, she simply showed up and sat beside him on the porch, watching the trees as he sipped his coffee. They had their routines. Mornings were for walking the trail. Afternoons, Nathan chopped while Ember napped in the sunlight. Evenings, he'd read aloud to no one in particular, his voice low and steady, as Ember dozed nearby. They shared a rhythm that needed no explanation. Neighbors thought he was crazy, if you could even call them neighbors. The nearest house was 6 miles away. But word got around, as it always does in small towns. People whispered about the man who lived with a bobcat, who talked to her like she understood every word. Nathan never cared what they thought. Ember did understand. Not the words, maybe, but the meaning, the feeling, the intent. She knew when he was tired. She'd nudge his hand until he stopped working and sat down. She knew when he was sad, too. There were days he'd sit at the edge of the river, his hands clasped, eyes lost in the current. On those days, Ember stayed close, her body pressed lightly against his side. Not asking, not fixing, just there. Years passed like seasons. Ember grew sleek and strong, a full-grown bobcat now, fierce and beautiful. Her wildness never left her, but Nathan respected it. He didn't try to hold on too tightly. But even in the quietest lives, change comes. Nathan started moving slower. His walks shortened. He coughed more, rubbed his chest more often. At first, he ignored it. Then he made excuses. Just age, just fatigue. But Ember noticed before anyone else. She'd sit in front of him, staring with those sharp eyes, sensing something he wouldn't say. By the time Nathan saw a doctor, it was too late. The diagnosis came like a storm cloud, heavy and dark. Congestive heart failure. Months, maybe weeks. The doctors talked about medications, about hospice care, about things that didn't matter in the forest. Nathan didn't want hospitals, but his body eventually gave him no choice. And so, for the first time in years, he left the forest, left Ember. The day he was taken, she followed the truck down the dirt road until the trees swallowed her. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. But her eyes stayed fixed on that road long after the sound of tires faded. Back in the hospital, Nathan kept her picture near his bed. A nurse taped it to the wall above the monitors. A blurry photo. Ember lying across his feet on the porch, the sunset casting gold on her back. Visitors would glance at it and smile, assuming it was a house cat. But the nurses knew better. They'd heard the story. The one about the man in the woods and the wild cat who came back. And none of them were surprised when Ember returned. The first few days after Nathan left, Ember remained near the edge of the forest. She didn't roam far, didn't hunt. She sat beside the stump where Nathan always left his coat, her ears twitching at every sound. She didn't cry. Bobcats don't mourn like people do. But there was a restlessness in her body, a stiffness in her limbs. She paced without purpose, her golden eyes always scanning the road. The porch steps creaked in the wind. The door stayed shut. The windows reflected only trees. Ember started returning less to the cabin and more to the road. Every morning, she'd walk the dirt path down to the point where the trees opened up and the old truck had disappeared weeks earlier. She would sit there, completely still, her body a quiet silhouette against the golden grass. She didn't understand hospitals. She didn't know why Nathan hadn't come back. But something in her had changed. Her routine, the rhythm they'd built over years, was broken, and she knew something was wrong. Wild instincts told her to move on, to return to survival. But instincts warred with something deeper. Memory, bond. And memory held on longer. Then came the day the neighbor arrived. Old Bill, who rarely visited and never stayed long, showed up with a tired sigh and a rolled-up tarp. He unlocked the cabin door with keys Nathan had trusted him with and stepped inside. Ember, watching from the trees, didn't move. Bill wasn't a bad man. He fed the animals sometimes. He'd even left food out for Ember before. But today, something about his presence felt different. Final. He opened windows, aired out the cabin. He moved slowly, as if not wanting to disturb the silence Nathan had left behind. He dusted off the bookshelf, picked up the fallen flannel shirt from the floor, and folded it quietly. And that's when Ember stepped into the clearing. He heard her before he saw her. The faint crackle of leaves, the low growl, not threatening, just low and uncertain. When he turned, Ember stood at the edge of the porch, her body crouched but her eyes steady. Bill didn't reach for her. He just nodded. "I figured you'd be back," he muttered. Ember stepped closer. She sniffed the edge of the porch. Then slowly, carefully, she climbed the steps and entered the cabin. The air was colder now, empty of Nathan's scent. But she wandered from room to room, pausing at the chair he always sat in, nudging the blanket that had fallen beside the fireplace. Bill watched her silently. "She misses him," he whispered later to his wife on the phone. "You can see it in her body, in her eyes." He stayed for a few hours, then left, locking the door behind him. Ember didn't follow. She curled up under the chair and stayed there until moonlight spilled through the windows. But something inside her had shifted. The stillness was no longer comfort. It was unbearable. 3 days later, she left the cabin entirely. She traveled further than she ever had before, through dry creek beds and silent fields, across roads she'd never crossed. It was as if she was following something invisible, something the wind carried only she could sense. Her paws grew rough. Her muscles ached, but she kept moving. And then she reached the edge of town. It was a place she had never dared to go before. Too loud, too unnatural. Cars roared past in sudden bursts. Lights blinked even during the day. Smells of gasoline, concrete, and metal choked the air. Dogs barked behind fences. People shouted at boxes they carried in their hands. Everything was wrong. And yet, she pressed forward. One woman screamed when she saw Ember padding along the sidewalk. A man across the street dropped his coffee, but Ember didn't respond. She moved with purpose, weaving between parked cars, her nose to the wind. Animal control was called. A few minutes later, 2 officers pulled up in a van. One held a tranquilizer gun. The other tried to coax Ember with food. But then a nurse came out from the hospital. She had seen the photo, the one above Nathan's bed. And as she watched this wildcat move with quiet desperation toward the main entrance, something clicked. "That's her," she said, breathless. "That's Ember." The officers hesitated. The Bobcat looked up, her eyes locked with the nurse's. There was no aggression in her stance, no threat, just urgency. And then, something no one expected, she sat, right at the front steps, not moving, not hiding, just waiting. The nurse, slowly and carefully, approached her, whispering, not reaching, not pushing, just acknowledging. Ember blinked slowly, then tilted her head upward, scanning the windows, the smell, the air. The nurse spoke quietly into her radio. "She's not dangerous. She's here for him." Security cleared the path. A crowd had begun to gather. Phones out, whispers rippling like wind. The animal control officers backed off, unsure what to do. No one had protocol for this. The nurse looked down at Ember and whispered, "Come on, let's get you to him." Ember rose. She followed her, step by step, through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, her claws tapping softly on the floor. She passed wheelchairs for stands, startled patients, and murmuring staff. But no one stopped her. The elevator ride was silent. The nurse stood beside her, not daring to move. And when the doors opened onto the ICU floor, Ember stepped out first. She didn't need directions. She walked down the corridor and stopped at the door. Nathan was there, smaller, quieter, pale than before. Machines surrounded him, pulsing and blinking. Tubes ran from his arms. His breaths were shallow and slow. But he was there. Ember entered the room, and without a sound, she leapt onto the bed, curled her body beside his, and laid her head across his chest, just like she used to. Everyone watching from the hallway stopped breathing for a moment, and inside that room, time seemed to pause again. This was no longer reunion. It was a return, one final act of loyalty, a wild animal crossing every instinct, every boundary, every fear, because something deeper called her back. Nathan didn't wake. Not fully, but the moment Ember laid her head on his chest, something shifted in him. The monitors showed no sudden spike, no dramatic change, but the rhythm of his heart, once jagged and fading, steadied slightly, as if his body recognized her presence. As if somewhere deep inside, he felt her return. Ember didn't move. Her ears twitched with each mechanical beep, but her body remained still, curled against the only human who had ever mattered to her. Her eyes stayed open, watching him, watching the machines, watching the way the nurses moved in and out of the room with soft steps and heavy eyes. The doctor came later that afternoon. He stood at the doorway, arms crossed, eyebrows raised at the sight of a bobcat beside his patient. But he didn't say anything, just nodded to the nurse and stepped back. The staff had stopped trying to explain the situation. It was beyond their training, beyond science. This was something else. Nathan's condition hadn't improved. In fact, he was drifting further away. Each day, a little slower, a little quieter. Ember hadn't left his side, not even for food. The staff had placed a small bowl of water near the corner of the room, and someone brought in raw chicken slices once a day. Sometimes she ate. Mostly she didn't. Her hunger wasn't for food. On the third night, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked over the city like a warning. Rain slammed against the windows, streaking the glass in long, trembling lines. The power flickered. For a moment, the lights dimmed, and in that dimness, Ember stood. She didn't growl, didn't make a sound, but she turned to face the door, her body rigid, eyes locked on something beyond the walls. The nurse closest to the room paused when she saw her, a chill running down her spine. Animals sense things before humans do. Things we can't explain. Ember stepped off the bed, not away from Nathan, but toward the window. She stood there motionless, as lightning lit up the sky. Then, slowly, she looked back at him. Something about her movement, slow, deliberate, made the air in the room feel heavier. That night, Nathan's breathing grew more shallow. The machines hissed, the numbers fell, and the quiet returned. The nurse who had first recognized Ember sat beside the bed now, her hand gently resting on Nathan's wrist, the other on her lap. She watched Ember return to his side, watched her climb back onto the bed, and rest her head not on his chest this time, but across his shoulder, closer to his face, like she was listening for something more than breath. And then she did something none of them expected. She nudged his chin softly with her nose, then pressed her forehead against his, her eyes closing. The nurse wiped her cheek quietly. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered to the night shift tech standing behind her. "Me neither," he said. "It's like she knows." But that wasn't what shocked them most. What shocked them came the next morning. Nathan's sister arrived, weary-eyed and tense. She had flown in from out of state. Only recently told how serious his condition had become. She hadn't known about Ember. When she stepped into the room and saw the wild animal curled against her brother, her breath caught. "Is she safe?" she asked, unsure whether to enter. "She's been with him every moment," the nurse replied softly. "He's calmer with her here." The sister hesitated, then nodded. She approached slowly, stopping just short of the bed. Ember lifted her head, eyes scanning her, unblinking. A moment passed. The tension between wild and human held in the air like a thread. Then Ember did something no one expected. She stood and stepped off the bed, slowly approaching Nathan's sister. She stopped just a few inches away, then sat. Her gaze was direct, not hostile, not afraid. Almost deliberate, like she was passing something on. Nathan's sister lowered herself to the floor, unsure what else to do. She knelt in front of the Bobcat, face level with hers. They stayed like that for a moment, two beings bound by love for the same person. And then Ember turned away. She walked back to the bed, rested her head once more on Nathan's chest. But this time it didn't last long. By evening, Ember had moved to the window again. She paced softly. The nurse entered and tried to calm her, thinking perhaps the noise from the storm or the shift in the environment had unsettled her. But Ember kept pacing, her body tight with something unspoken. Nathan's sister sat in the chair beside him, reading old letters she'd found in his cabin. Ember stopped at the corner of the room and stared, not at her, at the bag near her feet, the one she had brought with her. It was subtle at first, just a glance, then another, then a slow, deliberate approach. Ember nudged the bag. Once, twice. The sister blinked. "What are you trying to say?" Inside the bag were some of Nathan's things. Clothes, a photograph, a worn notebook. She opened the zipper. Ember's nose immediately went to the notebook. She pawed at it. The sister opened it, flipping through pages filled with handwritten notes, journal entries, and in them, pages and pages about Ember. December 12th. Ember followed me into the stream today. She hates the water, but she wouldn't leave me alone until I sat down. February 3rd. Slept with her curled against my legs. First time she initiated it. Think I've finally earned her trust. Page after page. Tears welled in her eyes. "He really loved you." Ember blinked slowly. The room grew quieter as night settled. Nathan's heart rate dropped again. The machines adjusted. The numbers told the truth. He was slipping further away. But the energy in the room wasn't frantic. It was soft, accepting. And then, with a movement so slow it was barely noticed, Nathan's fingers twitched. Not in pain, not in reflex. He moved them toward the space beside him, toward Ember. And she was there. She curled back into that space, gently pressing her side against him, her head near his arm. The nurse watched from the doorway, hand over her mouth. The sister stood beside the bed now, silent and still. There were no words, only breath, only the weight of goodbye beginning to take shape. The room had grown impossibly quiet, not in the way hospitals are always quiet. No, this was different. It was the kind of silence that settles over everything like a final snowfall. Soft, still, inevitable. Nathan's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven waves. The machines beeped steadily, but lower now, slower. Even they seemed to be winding down, mirroring the pace of the man they were supporting. The nurses, though moving through their usual routines, had started speaking in hushed voices, as though the weight of what was coming demanded reverence. Ember didn't move. She hadn't left his side for more than a few minutes since her arrival. She refused food now, even water. Her focus was singular. She watched his face, breathing with him, responding to his faintest movements, an instinct far beyond training or habit, something ancient, sacred. Then came the moment no one expected. The doctor returned with Nathan's latest test results. He stood at the end of the bed, reading quietly from the chart. His expression was calm, clinical, until he looked up. Nathan's eyes were open, not fully, not brightly, but open. The room froze. He wasn't speaking, couldn't speak, but his eyes moved slowly, first to the window, then painstakingly to Ember. She leaned in the moment he focused on her, nose to his cheek, her body trembling with restrained emotion. The nurse whispered, "He's aware." Nathan's sister was already at the bedside, her hand gently on his. "Nathan, can you hear me?" He didn't answer, but his lips parted just slightly, a breath drawn with intention, not reflex. His hand twitched beneath hers, then shifted faintly, fingers moving toward Ember's paw, resting just beside his arm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The Bobcat pressed closer to him. Her breathing quickened. For a wild animal, it was a display of emotion few would believe. But everyone in that room could feel it. Something was happening, something real. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the moment passed. His eyes closed again. His hand fell still. Ember didn't react right away. She stayed there, body curled against him, ears alert. The nurse reached for the chart. The doctor adjusted the four. Nathan's sister wiped her eyes and leaned her forehead to his hand, holding it gently in hers. But Ember, she was still listening, and what she heard next was something no one else could. The final breath. It was soft, gentle, but it was final. The machine gave one last reading, then stopped. No alarm, no scream, just the silence. Ember lifted her head slowly, her ears twitching. She looked at Nathan's face, then at the nurse, then at the door, and then she stood, not frantic, not panicked, purposeful. She walked to the foot of the bed and sat, her eyes locked on Nathan's sister. For a long moment, the two just stared at each other, and then the sister whispered, "You knew before we did." The nurse approached carefully, her voice trembling. "Should we take her out now?" But Nathan's sister shook her head. "Not yet. She stays." Ember stayed. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Staff coming and going. Forms signed, machines disconnected. People whispered condolences. One nurse returned with a small white rose and placed it on the bedside table. Another folded Nathan's blanket, now unused, and tucked it under his arm. But Ember didn't flinch. She stayed at the foot of the bed, silent, watching. By evening, the hospital allowed Nathan's body to remain in the room a few extra hours. Exceptions were made, unspoken, understood, and when the time came to move him, something remarkable happened. As the attendants approached, Ember stepped forward, not blocking them, but walking with them, down the hallway, all the way to the exit. Every person in the hallway paused to watch. Phones remained in pockets. No one dared break the moment with a flash or a comment. They just watched, breath held, as the Bobcat escorted the body of the man who had saved her, who had loved her, out of the building. At the loading dock, she stopped. She didn't climb into the van. She didn't chase after it. She just stood, watching until the doors shut and the vehicle rolled away into the night. Then she turned and walked. No hesitation. She passed the staff, the parking lot, the hedges. She slipped through the back fence and vanished into the trees behind the hospital grounds. The next day, Nathan's sister returned to the cabin. She hadn't planned to, but something called her there, a need to be where he had been happiest, where he and Ember had shared their quiet world. When she arrived, the door was still locked. The porch was still dusted with leaves. But inside, the air felt warm, lived in, and on the floor near the fireplace was Ember. She looked thinner, tired, but calm. Nathan's sister didn't speak. She set down her bag and sat quietly near the fireplace, knees pulled close. Ember didn't move toward her, but she didn't move away either. Hours passed. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Nathan's sister lit a fire, just like he used to. She found one of his old mugs, filled it with tea, and sat back in the chair he always loved. Then she looked over. Ember was watching her, and slowly, hesitantly, Ember stood, patted forward, and curled up at her feet. It wasn't the same. It never would be. But in that moment, something passed between them. Not a replacement, not an understanding. Just a thread, a fragile, beautiful thread of memory. The beginning of something new. The sun rose quietly the next morning, filtering through the tall pines that surrounded Nathan's cabin. A light mist clung to the forest floor, catching the early golden light and wrapping the clearing in a soft, ethereal glow. Birds chirped hesitantly, as if unsure whether the silence of the past days had passed. The world had continued moving, as it always did, but inside the cabin, time still felt slowed. Gentle, changed. Nathan's sister stood by the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, the same one Nathan used to use, the one with the faded chip along the rim. She watched as Ember sat just beyond the porch, her eyes scanning the woods, alert yet peaceful. There was no fence around the property. Nathan had never believed in cages, not for himself, and certainly not for Ember. She was free, always had been. She had simply chosen to stay. They'd fallen into a quiet rhythm over the past week. The sister didn't try to touch her, didn't try to lead. She simply existed nearby, moving gently through the house, preparing food, keeping the fire burning, and speaking softly when she felt the need. Ember responded not with affection, but with presence. She was there, not out of duty, not out of grief, but because something in her recognized that this place, this woman, still carried Nathan's scent, his energy, his peace. One afternoon, as Nathan's sister cleaned out a drawer in the study, she came across a folded piece of notebook paper. It was yellowed slightly at the edges, handwritten in the same calm, blocky letters Nathan used for everything. The paper was creased, handled many times, as if he'd read it over again and again. At the top was a simple line, "If I go first." She unfolded it and sat on the edge of the couch, the fire crackling behind her. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't heavy, just honest. If I go first, don't trap her. Don't cage her. Let her choose where to be. She's wild, but she's also home. If she stays, give her the quiet. That's what she understands. If she leaves, let her. She knows the forest better than any of us. And if she comes back, it's because she wanted to, not because she was lost. The sister read it twice. Then a third time. She looked up and out the window. Ember was still there, still watching the woods, still breathing the crisp morning air, as if she'd always been part of that forest. 2 days later, the sister packed her things. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she knew this place wasn't hers. It had been Nathan's. And in a strange, silent way, it now belonged to Ember, too. She left the door open as she walked out. Not wide, just enough. A gesture. A choice. She placed a folded note on the kitchen counter beside a small photo of Nathan, taken years ago with Ember curled beside him like a guardian. Then she stepped outside, pausing on the porch for one last look. Ember was watching her. Their eyes met, and in that long, still gaze, something passed between them again. A kind of farewell, but not one of sorrow. More like acknowledgement. Nathan's sister whispered, "Thank you for being there right till the end." She walked down the steps, along the overgrown path, and disappeared into the trees. The cabin was quiet again. For a while, Ember didn't move. She sat in the same spot until the sun reached its peak in the sky. Then she rose, stretched slowly, and padded up the porch steps. She nudged the door with her shoulder, pushing it open further, then walked inside. She explored each room, her paw steps silent on the wooden floor. The kitchen, the hallway, the chair by the fire. She paused there a moment, her eyes scanning the room, then leapt gracefully into the chair, curling into the familiar fabric. That night, the stars came out early. The forest was silent but not empty. In the distance, an owl hooted. Leaves rustled gently under the soft stir of a breeze. And inside the cabin, the fire danced quietly in the hearth. Ember slept, and in her dreams, perhaps, she ran through the woods beside the man who had once carried her in his arms when she was too weak to stand. Perhaps she remembered the first night he stayed awake beside her, whispering things she didn't understand but somehow knew to trust. Or maybe she dreamed of nothing at all, just the warmth of the fire, the strength of his presence, and the deep, unspoken truth of a bond that needed no words. In the weeks that followed, hikers passing near the edge of the woods sometimes spoke of seeing a bobcat near an old cabin, one that didn't run, that simply watched, golden eyes calm and quiet. Some said she was guarding something. Others believed she was grieving. But those who heard the real story, they understood. She wasn't staying because she was trapped in the past. She was staying because she remembered love. And every time the wind stirred the pine trees or the door creaked open with a gust, it felt as if Nathan was still there, his voice in the leaves, his hand in the air. In the end, Ember never truly said goodbye. She just stayed. And sometimes that's the most loyal goodbye of all.